we're going to be looking at the current state of affairs for the Iraqi Security Forces and their prospects for future success, particularly in what looks to be the lead-up to the operation to recapture Mosul from the Islamic State. Of course, it's a very important time for the Iraqi Security Forces, coming fresh off of their relative victory in Fallujah and continuing on clearing operations to the west of Anbar province. The expectation is now they will turn their attention to Mosul, arguably the most significant operation that the Iraqi Security Forces have undertaken. With this presentation, we're going to look at the current state of play, take a look at, very briefly, some of the equipment acquisitions since the invasion of Islamic State in 2014 and the relative impact some of that equipment may or may not have had. I'm going to go through a couple challenges that have been fairly endemic to the Iraqi Security Forces throughout the campaign and their battles. Then we'll turn our attention to the battle for Mosul and what we might be able to anticipate or draw from some of the evidence that we can see building up to this point. We have here a map which basically breaks down the holdings of Islamic State from about early 2015 to about middle 2016, or from about last month. Now, the black is the territory that was currently held by Islamic State, and then the red is actually what has been taken from Islamic State in the last 18 months, arguably the height of Islamic State's power. Now, we see here in front of us, obviously, Syria and Iraq. Islamic State does not obviously recognize that border at all. We're, of course, focusing on the Iraqi Security Forces and the operations to reclaim territory. And as you can see, I mean, some of the major takeaways here is largely, you can see in the west of Iraq, the west of the country, quite significant progress made, but you see how closely that Islamic State territory extended towards Baghdad, and obviously Fallujah, a city that was just retaken about 6 weeks ago. I would just go from what is basically last month to the changes that's occurred here just in this past month. Now, this is significant because you can see that for that red block right there has basically severed Islamic State-held territory that's extended down towards the Kirkuk region. I would expect that some level of security operations will continue on in the coming months along the Euphrates River Valley and pushing on to the western Iraqi towards the Syrian border, if only to create enough space and distance in between the major populated areas of the Euphrates River to ensure those areas are secure as possible while more troops are augmented for the northern push. There's also offensives mostly led by the Kurds that are occurring just west of Kirkuk to try to eliminate that salient that you see extending northeast of Baji. Quite a bit of equipment that has been delivered, perhaps the most notable of these being the Mi-28 and Mi-35 attack helicopters. Iraq not really having any sort of dedicated attack platforms, especially rotary wing, until these have been recently introduced. The last Mi-28, I believe, delivered only a few weeks ago, so they currently have a full set of the NE variants. Also making its debut in combat, the CH-4, the Chinese-built UAV, able to deploy weapons, so not just a surveillance UAV, but actually a combat platform. And then we have some relatively new and some relatively old Russian and Soviet kit, T-72s, BMP-1s, TS-1A, rocket artillery, D-20 artilleries. These have been on the battlefield for quite some time, have still proven their mettle, and have continued to be delivered to the Iraqi forces, mostly secondhand through third-party donors. Some of the newer Air Force equipment coming in, the Su-25s, a portion of these, of course, were returned from Iran, gifted back to Iraq after been, I suppose, relocated to Iran during previous Gulf War. And the new delivery is about 10 F-16C and D models and L-159As, these being the training variants of these light attack aircraft from the Czech Republic. These are all relatively new introductions to the Iraqi Air Force, and it's important to remember that essentially everything here, except for perhaps the Su-25 and the Soviet equipment that we mentioned in the Army, was all ordered prior to the Islamic State offensive, therefore showing that Iraq had planned for a much different battle to be waged and giving itself proper air superiority and multi-use strike platforms with some of the aircraft, but almost exclusively conducting air-to-ground missions. So many diverse and fractious anti-IS forces in Iraq right now is extremely difficult for any party to coordinate these forces in any semblance of a unified approach to anti-IS. We've got, of course, the Iraqi Security Forces, which they themselves comprise the Iraqi Army, the Iraqi federal and local police. I've also got Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces in the north, and then the wider popular mobilization forces, the largely Shia militias, as well as tribal fighters, Sunnis. And if it were just that, that would be complex enough. But any one of those groups that I just mentioned also is subdivided into sometimes dozens of groups. Kurdish forces have 4 different subdivisions, 2 major divisions geographically that recently the U.S. has been trying to bridge by raising a couple brigades, training those through a specialized training program to try to break down what we've seen previously as regional forces focused on very regional tasks. For the Kurdish, the KDP and the PUK militias, trying to race some of those boundaries to make a more unified Kurdish fighting force. The Shia militias, of course, we're talking about nearly a dozen factions, all with different varying degrees of loyalties to different parts of the government, extra-state government, Iran, to religious leaders outside of Iraq, to political parties within Iraq, and they're far from being a unified force themselves. Logistical support is always been a challenge with the Iraqi army, especially after its reconstitution over 15 years ago now, I suppose. But it has improved quite a bit, especially in the last 18 months or last year to 18 months. It was not in a good state to begin with. The invasion of IS shattered a lot of support elements as they were. The attention was turned, obviously, to combat units and their effectiveness, and logistics was a bit of a byline for, we'll solve that problem when we come to it. But when some of these operations started taking shape and the Iraqi forces actually had to project power to stay deployed in the field for some time, it did force logistics effort into play, and the U.S. and other coalition allies have really seen this logistics support and coordination as a key contribution they can make, especially the U.S. being able to manage distribution of materials, fuel, ammunition. Key coordinator, that's one of the roles that it's played from a very early stage in these counter-IS operations, and will probably continue to do so, especially as the operations become more complex moving into Mosul. This is just a bit of a heat map, just to highlight very briefly, looking at just last month. So this is July 2016. Red obviously indicating the level of activity, conflict that is occurring right now. And obviously it comes as no surprise that it's along those fault lines where Kurdish forces are starting to push into Islamic State territory to position themselves to the north of Mosul, and also forces coming up from central Iraq via Baji, via Kirkuk, to basically sever, as we saw, that link in between the holdings outside of Kirkuk and Mosul. You also see what we call sort of mopping up operations throughout the Euphrates River Valley there, down by Ramadi, just south of that golden box there. There's been a lot of questions about, what units may or may not take part in this. They could use one or both axes of approach on the Tigris. There is a major MSR highway that goes on both sides of the river. I believe Highway 1 is to the west, and perhaps Highway 8, I believe, is on the east of the river. But there are several axes of approach into Mosul. Obviously, you don't have to use the hardball roads here, but it does make especially the movement of logistical supply much quicker and easier, and therefore it will probably be more or less used in conjunction with moving up these axes, securing territory, slowly moving toward Mosul. Now, the question, obviously, as well, is about the PMF or the Shia militias. What role will they play? And there are several units that want to play a very active role in Mosul. They are currently trying to justify, why they should. There's been questions of in what capacity. It's our assessment that they're not required to take Mosul. The Iraqi security forces themselves are largely going to spearhead this offensive. They don't need to be backfilled by what is basically light infantry of the Shia militia brigade on the direct offensive.